as is typical, this week is no different. Again, I'll remind you of this verse in 2 Timothy chapter 3 that know also that in the last days perilous times shall come. For men shall be lovers of their own selves, covetous, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, without natural affection, truce breakers, false accusers, incontinent, fierce, despisers of those that are good, traitors, heady, high-minded, lovers of pleasures more than lovers of God, having a form of godliness but denying the power thereof. From such turn away. And again, this is another week where it seems that this verse seems particularly true. I've been accused by some of being too negative, and I guess what I would say is, okay, maybe I am, but it is the state of the world. And I live in Dublin, Ohio, which has been voted one of the, I think a couple of years ago was voted the happiest city in America. And so you ought to be glad I live in the happiest city of America, or I'd really be negative. So, and that's with me living in it. It's still the happiest city in America. This is just a few things. We live in this state of lawlessness. Acapulco used to be this great resort city. Now it's this place where people really are afraid to go because of the violence and lawlessness that's taking place there. Now I'm going to talk about the president now for a little bit. I will make one notation. I mentioned this a little bit last week that Benjamin Netanyahu has been criticized heavily because he hasn't come out and spoken out against Trump and Trump's reaction to what took place in Charlottesville. And just as a reminder, Charlottesville incident, the neo-Nazi, white supremacist, idiots, evil people that went out there and tried to provoke a response, and they did provoke a response, and a lady got killed needlessly. That was only a week ago yesterday. It seems like it was like a month ago, given all the other things that happened this week. But Netanyahu's been criticized a lot because while he just didn't speak out, he needed to speak up. His son, interestingly, this was in, I think, the New York Times. Mr. Trump even received some backing for his two sides to the story approach, including from Yair Netanyahu, the prime minister's elder son, who weighed in with a blunt post on his Facebook page denouncing far-left anti-fascist groups and the Black Lives Matter movement as thugs. Quote, "The neo-Nazi scums in Virginia hate me and my country," he wrote in English, "but they belong to the past. Their breed is dying out. However, the thugs of Antifa and BLM who hate my country and America too, in my view, just as much are getting stronger and stronger and becoming super dominant in American universities and public life." And I agree with what he said, that, there were maybe 500, if that, of these neo-Nazis out of millions and millions of people. But because the president didn't criticize those that are on the left, and I'm going to show you a few things. I've showed you some pictures of leftist groups beating the neo-Nazis because they came there armed and ready for a fight. And you'll see a little bit about that. But the New York Times, or LA Times this week, had an article, editorial, and this is like the 8th in a series that they've had. Enough is enough. These are not normal times. The man in the White House is reckless and unmanageable, a danger to the Constitution, a threat to our democratic institutions. Now, I want to say one thing. There has not been a single journalist arrested, thrown in jail, or anything. They're still free to write the nonsense that they write. Nobody's putting them in jail, and nobody's threatening them with that. But frankly, they are a threat, these journalists that lie. And they should be, and because somebody calls them out on it. And I listen to Dennis Prager. Dennis Prager is a reasonable guy. I don't agree with him on everything, but he's a good thinker. And he says, he spoke Friday in his first hour, "I'm speaking in very somber terms because if I was telling you, if you saw what was going on in me, I would be yelling, and I don't like to be yelling." So I yell sometimes, and I was accused of yelling. But this unhinged nature of what's going on with regard to the president sort of was encapsulated the other night after the Arizona speech by the president, I think on Monday night. And this is Don Lemon and James Clapper talking on CNN. Listen to this.
I'm just going to speak from the heart here. What we have witnessed was a total eclipse of the facts. Someone who came out on stage and lied directly to the American people and left things out that he said in an attempt to rewrite history, especially when it comes to Charlottesville.
When I've listened and watched something like this from a president that I found more disturbing, having some understanding of the levers of power that are available to a president if he chooses to exercise them, I found this downright scary and disturbing. I think Bakari is right on the money, though, that this is not a surprise. Interesting to contrast last night's teleprompter Trump performance versus tonight, which is, of course, the real Trump, just as it was in the unglued impromptu press conference at Trump Tower. So I just find this extremely disturbing.
Are you questioning his fitness?
Yes, I do. I really question his ability to, his fitness to be in this office. And I also am beginning to wonder about his motivation for it. Maybe he is looking for a way out.
Is he a threat to national security, the president?
Well, he certainly could be. Again, having some understanding of the levers that a president can exercise, I worry about, frankly, the access to nuclear codes. If he, in a fit of pique, he decides to do something about Kim Jong-un, there's actually very little to stop him.
Well, you certainly didn't in all your years when you were in office directing national intelligence. And you and Brennan went to the Aspen Institute and essentially called for Trump to be removed from office. I don't know if it rose to the level of treason. So CNN, I guess they're trying to be fair and balanced. They decided to put together a panel of Trump supporters. And I think it's just interesting. I'll play a little bit of the clip. So they get, I don't know, 6 or 8 Trump supporters together. And I don't remember the name of the news anchorette or whatever they call her. I don't remember her name, but watch her reactions to the questions she asked. This is kind of interesting. And by the way, they're talking about taking down this statue in New York that you see in the picture on the right. That's the statue of Christopher Columbus. The area there is called Columbus Circle. So they want to, and I will say the president, I'll give him credit. He said, where are they going to go next? Are they going to go after Washington and Jefferson? Yeah, and Christopher Columbus too. So yeah, they're going to change the name of Washington. Anyway, so here's this panel, just a few minutes of this.
How many of you, show of hands, were troubled by the president's response to the violence in Charlottesville? None of you minded how President Trump responded.
No. I didn't see anything wrong with it. I mean, he addressed the problem. I mean, let's face the reality. There are problems on both sides.
Do you think that neo-Nazis and white supremacists are the same as those who are protesting them?
I think it's ridiculous to have me choose between Hitler and Stalin, which is what I consider both groups are.
This guy.
And why are the people who turned out to protest Nazis,
Not all
why
of
are
them.
they Stalin to you?
The Antifa group to me is totally a very Stalinish kind of group.
How so?
If you're willing to set fires and burn places to the ground, that doesn't sound like a very peaceful group to me.
But they didn't.
They're both the same evil.
They didn't use those tactics in Charlottesville, Mark.
So then I blame the government.
Why do you blame the governor or the government for a white supremacist mowing down a crowd of people and killing someone?
Because they didn't protect the people that day.
So blood and soil was a Nazi slogan, and you heard them saying Jews will not replace us. Is it possible that very fine people were in that crowd?
Not in that crew. Nope. But those crazy, I don't know what else to call them. I probably can't say it on TV, but they still had the right to say those crazy things.
That's the night before the clash happened. The Antifa people, the protesters, they didn't show up Friday night. They showed up Saturday. These protesters showed up the second day. They came there to do battle with them. They showed up with helmets, body armor, clubs. They showed up with balloons filled with urine.
Yeah, they didn't
And
throw
these,
weapons at
guys,
local.
and these guys showed up with semi-automatic weapons.
And
In
that's
the state of Virginia, open carry is legal. You can walk down
but
the
again,
street.
it seems to me that you're giving these guys a green light. The white
No,
supremacists.
the green light is
Not
not
light.
Not at all.
Why do you seem more angry at Antifa than at the neo-Nazis in the
I'm not more angry. It's equal. The media is not covering it. They're only focused on making neo-Nazis and white supremacists out to be Trump supporters, and they're the issue of the problem.
I think we're moving kind of further away from the point of what this conversation should be. What happened that day was a tragedy, and it should never have happened to begin with. No one here is supporting the neo-Nazis or the white supremacists, and that narrative is really negative. But what we are talking about is President Trump's response, and he stood in front of America and he condemned the violence that occurred that day.
You're talking about 300 or 400 people in Charlottesville.
Meaning the neo-Nazis.
Yeah, there's 60 million people voted for President Trump. Why don't we get our say? Those people aren't nothing. Y'all, Democrats have idiots, Republicans have idiots. But we're talking about us, the 60 million that's for Trump. We don't do stuff like that.
Why isn't it the easiest thing in the world for the president to say, neo-Nazis have no place in this country?
He said it Monday.
He condemned them explicitly.
He said it Monday. He didn't know the facts.
Because he just came out on TV, like it just happened.
I think
So that went on for about 8 minutes, and I think she's clueless. I mean, I really think she does not understand the nature of the left. And it annoys me. I don't want to start yelling. I'll speak in somber monotones now that these people have jobs. Why don't they hire those 6 people? They were articulate. They got it, and they based their thing on the facts. But she wants to push a narrative that everybody is a neo-Nazi and ignores what's going on in the left. And now this is going to cause even more problem. This is President Trump pardoned, as he sort of intimated that he would do in the Arizona speech, that he would pardon Sheriff Joe Arpaio, and he did. And now everybody's all upset. It's a constitutional crisis because he didn't go through the office of the pardon council. There's no office of pardon council in the Constitution. It's something that's been created, and the president can do it. And one headline, I think this came out of the editorial page of the New York Times, Obama, where are you? Well, let's revisit so Ben Rhodes came out. Remember Ben Rhodes? He was the children's story writer that helped put together the Iranian agreement. Obama used his pardon, he tweeted, and commutation power to give a second chance to people who deserved empathy, not racists who showed none. Linda Sarsour came out supporting Maxine Waters. Annie Maxine doesn't mince any words, who said, I'm not surprised Trump pardoned racial profiler Arpaio. White nationalist KKK and Duke celebrated Trump's election because he is one of them. To which a former New York Times, Washington Post journalist said, yeah, well, Obama pardoned Oscar Lopez Rivera. This is what he was. Lopez Rivera remains unrepentant. He had his sentence commuted by Obama, released from prison. He's hardly been a model prisoner in one of 2 failed attempts to escape. He conspired with others inside and outside his prison to kill his way to freedom, attempting to procure grenades, rifles, plastic explosive, bulletproof vests, blasting caps, and armor-piercing bullets. After the FBI thwarted his plan, another 15 years was added to Lopez's original 55-year sentence, and Obama freed him from prison. He was one that did the bombing, the Puerto Rican terrorist bombing in New York City many years ago. Obama freed this piece of human garbage. And Trump pardoned a sheriff, an 85-year-old sheriff. They are unhinged. They have lost their minds. There it is. Caroline Glick has a good article in Friday's Jerusalem Post, Netanyahu's empathy for Trump, explaining why maybe Trump won't do this. And the reason is that Netanyahu, ever since he was in office back in the 90s, was accused of the same thing. He was accused of causing the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin. His wife was crazy. The nannies didn't like her. They were both mentally unhinged. That was in the late 90s. And they're still doing it. They're still going after him. They're still dreaming up prosecutions and what'll happen. So out in California, they were going to have a Patriot Prayer rally, a group who, in very stark terms, said, we don't want anything to do with white nationalists or neo-Nazis or anything. You guys stay away. We're just getting together to support the country. You know, because and some of these are Hispanics and blacks and whites and everybody in this group. So here's a news report, which includes a little interview with constitutional scholar Nancy Pelosi about freedom of speech. Well, hang on. I'm not sure why that's not playing. Okay, here we go.
What's in a name? Well, it depends on who you ask. The conservative group planning to rally at Crissy Field this weekend is adamant they are not white supremacists. But that's exactly what Nancy Pelosi called them. So KPIX 5 political reporter Melissa Kane went to ask the Democratic leader to explain her choice of words. Melissa.
Yeah, terms like neo-Nazi, white supremacist, white nationalist, alt-right, alt-left, fascist, Marxist, these loaded terms are being used daily these days. And as we prepare for this weekend's events, we looked at the Patriot Prayer group. Now, some of them are Trump supporters, but we wondered, does that make them extremists? In a press release, House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi called the event a white supremacist rally. And today she said Crissy Field is a special place.
And now they're going to give it as a venue to Nazis and white nationalists.
But is Patriot Prayer a bunch of white supremacists or Nazis or white nationalists? Not according to the Southern Poverty Law Center. Patriot Prayer is not listed as a hate group, and its leader, Joey Gibson, is not listed as an extremist. The center reported that at the most recent Patriot Prayer event, Gibson shouted from the stage, F white supremacists, F neo-Nazis.
Like Nancy Pelosi, she feels like she has to oppose our group. So she lies and says it's going to be a white supremacist rally, even though there's only one white speaker. You know, and so it's frustrating.
The Southern Poverty Law Center does point out that white supremacists have shown up to Patriot Prayer rallies before. And Patriot Prayer invited the often armed anti-government Oath Keepers to provide security on Saturday.
The Patriot Prayer group says they're not white supremacists or Nazis, that they're diverse, that people just show up.
Well, you know what?
How can they be held accountable for that?
Well, they're accountable for it, and we're going to hold them accountable for it.
Pelosi went as far as to disagree with the Park Service's interpretation of the Constitution.
Giving them the ability to cry wolf in a crowded theater. We're all committed to our Constitution and freedom of speech, God knows, in San Francisco, but not to endanger people. So the Park Service has to balance their ability to protect with their misguided view of the Constitution.
Congresswoman Barbara Lee says she's focused on preventing violence.
We have to keep our people, our constituents, our cities, our counties safe. But the free speech of anyone is something that we all agree on in terms of First Amendment rights. But we don't.
Now, we keep hearing the term, you can't yell fire or wolf in a theater.
How could the Park Service justify denying that organization their free speech rights?
Because the Constitution does not say that a person can yell wolf in a crowded theater. If you are endangering people, then you don't have a constitutional right to do that.
That's not actually true. You probably can. That phrase is from a 1919 Supreme Court case that has long been overruled. And when it comes to protests, there are generally two exceptions to the First Amendment. First, speech that is meant to and likely to incite, quote, imminent lawless action. Second rule, any direct face-to-face personal insults that inflict injury or breach the peace. There may be much of that this weekend. Melissa Kane, KPIX 5.
But if you look at the ads there that were in the San Francisco Chronicle, it was an anti-Marxism rally, no Marxism in Berkeley, protests to expose the plan of purging our nation from a free nation to a communist nation. And then they were going to have counter-protests to the anti-Marxism rally. That's the language of the San Francisco Chronicle. Counter-protesters plan to gather and march to the site of the anti-Marxism rally. And now, and I'm just taking this from the San Francisco Chronicle, which is not a right-wing newspaper, okay? You can imagine in San Francisco. This is a guy getting ready. Do you think he's what? The Patriot Prayer Rally or the Antifa group? He's the Antifa group. The counter-protesters. See this? Ready to rumble if it happens. And so they're going there to pick a fight. They went out and they had this yesterday. The prayer rally, the Patriot Prayer thing was canceled. But you need to understand is this group, they hate Jews. They support BDS. Does anybody ever say that on the left? No. You know why? Because they're being exposed for what they are. Dana Milbank. Do you see that title here, the opinion writer? The Trump administration's most prominent Jews disgrace themselves. Now we're singling out Jews because they're not on board with the left. And that's okay if you're on the left. There's an article in Jerusalem Post about it, and then this is a headline from the New York Times. Jewish Trump staff silent on his defense of rally with anti-Semitic marchers. So they looked up for the Jews, Mnuchin and Cohn and some others, and said, you're going to resign now because Trump didn't do what we wanted him to do to denounce the Nazis, neo-Nazis and white supremacists, which he did. I've heard him at least 3 times do this. But he's calling out the people on the left for their violent behavior. And they're anti-Jewish. But Trump is the it's projection, okay? When they start calling you names, that's what they are. They're identifying themselves. In the New York and Haaretz and the Jerusalem Post, this article was on the front page of Haaretz the other day, courting evangelical right, Israel to host a Christian media summit. And in one of the it was in Newsweek magazine. They went back and they dug out an article from 1981. Now, of course, they have the picture of Trump on the cover in this article that's on the Newsweek website. Why do Nazis hate Jews? How Christian politics fuels anti-Semitism in the United States. It was republished, but it came from 1980, I think it was 1981. The dramatic growth of Christian fundamentalism and moral majority politics may also spur anti-Semitism. Just last week, the Reverend Dan Foer, moral majority leader in New York, told a reporter Jews have a God-given ability to make money, almost a supernatural ability. They control this city. Even without such stereotyping, the fundamentalist emphasis on Christian politics and efforts to convert Jews are threatening, says William Gralnick of the American Jewish Committee in Atlanta. What it says is that the Jewish faith is not a valid path to salvation. It tends to separate us from grace. And it goes on. It's just a smear. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to pick up this old smear and smear evangelicals with this charge that they're anti-Semitics. When it's Antifa that's in the BDS movement that are anti-Semitic and anti-Jewish and anti-Zionist. It's insane. A court decision, and this is from the Independent in England, Great Britain, courts to get stuff on social media hate crime. Listen to some of these. Hate crimes committed on social media will be treated as seriously as similar street-based offenses. So, man, so the old rule, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me, is no longer valid in today's world. Alison Saunders, the director of public prosecutions, said such crimes had a corrosive effect on British society as she launched a crackdown on online abuse. I'll tell you what's had a corrosive effect on British society. Letting Pakistani grooming sex gangs rape and destroy the lives of hundreds of young girls in England, and the police and prosecutors cover it up. That destroys British society, not what somebody says, pointing it out on Facebook. They are... See, I've lost the somber tone thing already. According to the CPS, the move is designed to take into account the increasing number of online abuse cases and covers religious, racist, homophobic, and transphobic postings. Daniel Greenfield in Front Page Magazine has a very good article called The Church of the Left. And as you know, I've mentioned this many times, that leftism is a religion. The left has written its values into laws. Just a few quotes from this. The First Amendment assumes that the proper sphere of government is policies, not values. And so it protects the right of political participation and prohibits a state church that would define value. The government had the right to decide to go to war with France. It did not have a right to decide what you should believe. Politics extended into the realm of policies, not beliefs. But as religious belief declined, politics replaced it as the repository of moral and ethical values. This transformation began on the left. The left was the least religious in the traditional sense, and the most likely to build up an ideology of secular values with which to displace traditional religious values. The last century witnessed an extensive effort to scrub religious values. This is right in line with what Patrick Wood was talking about yesterday, and I'm sure he'll cover a little bit more today, but this effort was matched by an equally comprehensive project to replace them with the left's own values. Unlike the wall between church and state, there were few legal safeguards against writing values into legislation if they were irreligious ones. The church was deemed to be the true threat, not the state. But the end result looks very much like an establishment of religion. Even in the church sense, the values written into the legislation reflect those of certain churches, but not others. When nuns are forced to pay for birth control and Christian photographers with traditional beliefs are compelled to participate in gay weddings, the government is picking religious establishment winners and losers. The winners are roughly on the religious left and the losers on the religious right. And he's exactly right. A great analysis. The less secular religion functions as a theocracy. It promises salvation through socialism, warns that human sin will destroy the world through global warming, and is engaged in a perpetual struggle against those who do not share its values. It wages wars on religious freedom because it is a kind of religion. Now look, I respect Daniel Greenfield. I respect Caroline Glick, Melanie Phillips. I know they are not Christians, okay? But I respect them for the stand that they take because they see the problem. And you can go to the Southern Baptist ERLC convention in Nashville this past week, and you're not going to hear anybody talking about this, as far as I know. Politics is far more likely to turn violent over values rather than policy. Well, you can look that up on Front Page Magazine. I just don't want to sit here and read it for you. Great article by Daniel Greenfield. Now, what he says is true. Because this week there was the decision from the United States Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit in the Real Alternatives versus the Secretary of Health and Human Services. Now, listen, Trump's Justice Department is in control of these cases now. Trump said he was going to put a stop to this. I don't know why this case has not been withdrawn or that they've agreed to settle this case. Real Alternatives is a crisis pregnancy center. They are being forced to provide abortion coverage to their employees. And the Third Circuit ruled 2-1 that they have no basis to challenge that. Their religious freedom is irrelevant to the secular values. Do you see how it's out of balance? Now, there was a dissenting judge. And look, the president can change this tomorrow. He can stop this. Now, I've heard that Sessions is firing a bunch of people. Yeah, I want to see some action from somebody to stop this nonsense, okay? The time for talk is over. It's been 7 months, 8 months now, and we need to stop this nonsense. Judge Beckett dissenting said this: having been beaten back in earlier efforts to force the contraceptive mandate on the populace, the government has changed its tune a bit. It has come up with a new rationale for its erratically aggressive enforcement of that feature of the ACA, the Affordable Care Act. Republicans promised they would repeal that monstrosity. Did they do that? But the song it sings is essentially the same. Individuals whose faith prompts sincere opposition to paying for or facilitating the purchase of contraceptives cannot be heard to object. The only thing legitimately at issue is the regulation of insurance markets. According to the government, the mandate has nothing to do with deep questions about the beginning of life or the boundaries of moral culpability or about faith and one's obligations to God. Religious beliefs are not being burdened in any meaningful sense, so people should just stop complaining. That is the line pressed by the United States Department of Justice, and it is the line that is accepted by my colleagues in the majority, but I reject it. In my view, the individual plaintiffs have adequately pled and provided sufficient evidence to demonstrate that the contraceptive mandate is a substantial burden on their free exercise of religion. Having reached that conclusion, I confront the question that the majority avoids, whether the contraceptive mandate is narrowly tailored to support a compelling government interest. The answer is no. Time and again, courts have rejected the regulation because it is not the least restrictive means of achieving its objective. There are several other options that the government could have chosen to enforce its regulation without impinging on the rights of religiously devout individuals. And the Justice Department now controls it, and they can stop this case tomorrow. And I would challenge them, Attorney General Sessions, to do it. It's a great article in Melanie Phillips. She says this, it's called The Eclipse, a good article, just published the other Friday. The Eclipse of Reason in the West. Historical statutes are being toppled in America. Snarling, violent anti-fascists mirror the behavior they are supposedly against. Britain's conservative government is to enforce hate speech guidelines, which are as contestable as they are subjective. As we watch Western societies buckling under the bizarre combination of an apparently extreme concern to protect other people's feelings with an extreme attempt to suppress other people's opinions, many of us feel utter bewilderment. How can so many people who are ostensibly devoted to reason and freedom be behaving so irrationally and oppressively? It's easy to explain if you understand Scripture. It's Romans 1. They're under God's judgment. They've lost the ability to reason, and many of them are demonically controlled. Brian, edit that into somber tones, if you will, if I start. The Enlightenment she says, capital E, Enlightenment, is consuming its own progeny. In the West, the culture of reason is dying, brought down by a loss of faith and progress in the rationality that underpinned it. The replacement of objective truth by subjective experience has caused science itself to turn into a branch of unreason, underpinning the loss of rational discourse as evidence is hijacked by ideology. The age of reason was supposed to end all the ills in the world, since these were held to derive from the suppression by religion of the defining characteristic of the human race, the intellect. It was assumed that once exposed to the full power of the mind, these ills would fade away. But just like every other millenarian fantasy, this brave new world failed to materialize. War, bigotry, and tyranny did not come to an end. Materialism and science were heavily implicated in the two greatest tyrannies of the 20th century. Modernity lost its shine. Technology created enemy. Progress was a threat to the planet. Mankind was viewed as a pollutant. The Enlightenment project was yet another utopia that had failed. This is, you need to look this up, MelaniePhillips.com. This is a brilliant article. And she and Caroline Glick and Daniel Greenfield nail it. Almost every article they write is worthy of being read by Christians who want to think well. And we should put off this irrationality. It's infected the church. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the Middle East here in the time we have left. So early in the week, Netanyahu is going to meet with Putin over the Iranian presence in Syria. So they had a meeting. Now, what's going on in the Middle East, and I'll kind of jump around a little bit here because it's all interrelated, but Putin runs a country that is in, as Patrick Wood noted yesterday, a demographic crisis. It is collapsing from within. I mentioned a number of months ago that Foreign Policy and some other of the think tanks that are out there that analyze things, geopolitics, noted that Russia within Moscow has about a population of 25% Sunni Muslim. It is one of the reasons that Putin went into the Middle East. He wanted a southern port. He wanted an air base there because it gets a little cold in Russia in the winter. And they don't really have a nice warm water port, so he got that in Syria. But he also has a Sunni problem. And he went in there to deal with the Sunni problem that Bashar Assad had. And essentially what they've done is they've indiscriminately bombed Sunni areas. Those people have gotten on the move and moved into Europe, where Europe now has a Sunni Islam problem. And it's collapsing European societies. Somebody sent me a list. I didn't have time to verify it. About 7 or 8 major cities in England now have Muslim mayors. And they're not yet 10% of the population there. But as Western populations decline because of lower birth rates, those cultures with higher birth rates are replacing them at an alarming rate. I raise that because we know that there's a configuration of nations that are going to come against Israel in the last days. Persia, Iran, Russia, Turkey, Libya. And as I look and analyze it, what I see is an increasingly narrow window when some of those countries will be able to act in that manner, including Russia. And it always appears, if you read Ezekiel 38 and 39, that Russia appears to be a reluctant participant in this whole enterprise. I'll put hooks, not a hook, hooks. A couple things will drag you down into this battle. So Putin is in somewhat of a spot, but look, the Russian villages are disappearing was an article in Time magazine not too long ago. Russia's demographic problem dates back at least 100 years to the upheaval of the 1917 revolution. Both events curb population growth, foreshadowing the devastating impact of World War II when Russia lost 20 million people. More recently, birth rates plunged in the years after the chaotic 1991 collapse of the Soviet Union. These sorts of demographic catastrophes return to stunt population growth 2 decades after they happen as the number of women reaching their childbearing years drops. Russia is entering one of those periods now, recording 83,300 fewer births in the first 5 months of 2017 than 1 year prior. In 1 year, 100,000 fewer births in 1 month. In the first 5 months, I'm sorry. So, with regard to these villages that are, they talk about a village, Peskov, which borders Latvia and parts of Estonia, is among the worst hit regions in Russia. The population peaked at around 1.8 million in the 1920s. It's now down to 640,000 and projected to drop another 140,000 over the next 10 years. Researchers estimate that of 8,300 area villages in 1910, 2,000, 1/4 of them, no longer have permanent residents. It's a stunning collapse. So what it does is it gives Russia a very narrow window in which to operate. And so that's why I think Putin went into the Middle East to project power down there to kind of protect himself at home. This led to that article I mentioned last week in Institute for Study of War, understandingwar.org, the strategic convergence of Russia and Iran. And it talks about Syria. Iran and Russia support the Syrian regime against all opponents. Listen to what their summary is. Iran needs a friendly regime in Damascus to provide a secure base from which it can support Lebanese Hezbollah and conduct operations against Israel. Now, is there any prophetic passage that says that Persia will want to conduct operations against Israel? Russia requires a regime willing and able to guarantee long-term access to its air and naval bases on the Mediterranean Sea from which to challenge the U.S. and NATO. Minor divergences between Iran and Russia in their approach to the Syrian civil war reflect the friction normal to any coalition rather than signs of fragility. This is back in February. It's talking about an alliance between Persia and this northern power. And one of their objects is Israel. So this is the context in which, and it talks about Iraq and Afghanistan. And I'll mention that in just a moment because the president did a speech. Turkey is also involved. Iran and Russia both seek to pull Turkey out of the orbit of the U.S. and NATO while ending Ankara's support to opposition groups in Syria. Now, is there a prophetic passage that talks about an alliance between Russia and a northern power and Persia or Iran and Turkey? And the answer is yes. And get over this, the fact, well, Turkey's Sunni, it's largely Sunni, it's largely this. You throw in Kurdistan in the mix of this, which is a problem for Iraq, Iran, and Turkey, and you have a real mess. So Netanyahu went to meet with Putin. They had this meeting. Netanyahu said, it was a very good meeting. I mean, Netanyahu is going there because essentially what he sees happening are two things. One is he has to protect Israel. That's his job. And so he's going to Russia because he knows that Iran is supporting Hezbollah, which is on the northern border. Hezbollah effectively, I think, controls Lebanon. They have 150,000 or more rockets that they can fire. They have multiple rocket launchers. They say they can fire 4,000 in a day. And so Israel's been building up its defenses since the Lebanon war. I think it was 34, 35 days back in 2006. They've been building up their defenses against that. And I played you the clip of the Israeli Air Force chief who said, what took us 35 days, we'll do in 48 to 60 hours. So they think they have it under control, but they don't want to do that unless they have to. So Netanyahu goes to Putin and says, look, we're not going to mess with you guys in Syria. We'll let you alone pretty much, but you have to let us stop arms from getting to Hezbollah. And so far that sort of soft alliance has worked. But Russia's going to act in Russia's interest. So that one, they say, so the Institute for Study of War says the agreement between Russia and Iran, I always want to call it Persia, Russia and Iran, is not fragile. It's frayed at the edges, but it's pretty strong on where they're unified, because they want a Syrian government they can support, and so does Iran, because Iran wants to support Hezbollah. So that's not fragile. But the one between Israel and Russia is fragile and fraying at the edges. And Netanyahu went over there because he doesn't think that the U.S. is involved very much. And there were reports out this week where the U.S. people involved were saying, well, you know, as long as Iran and Russia are taking care of ISIS, you know, we'll help them do that. Well, what happens when ISIS leaves? It's a vacuum, right? So ISIS goes, you know, they flee to the West. Now the West has another problem with terrorism, which is good for Putin. You know, he doesn't care if Europe has a terrorism problem. And so into this vacuum comes Iran. And so Netanyahu, one of the messages he took to Putin was, we got to stop the Lebanization of Syria. Lebanon is always teetering on the brink. It was in civil war for decades. It's been relatively peaceful, but only because the Christian minority in Lebanon has submitted to the will of Hezbollah in many respects. Former envoy Dan Shapiro meant this week that the U.S. is worried about the Putin-Netanyahu bromance. And there's a way to get around that. With the defeat of the Islamic State in Syria nearing, Shapiro wrote that the situation is becoming more complicated and that Israel is rightfully concerned that allies of the Assad regime, Iran and Hezbollah, under Russian protection, will gain access to the areas vacated by ISIS fighters and use that territory to attack Israel and to establish a land bridge to facilitate the flow of arms and people to Lebanon. The former ambassador said that when the Islamic State stronghold in Syria at Raqqa falls, and if Donald Trump declares a victory over the organization and announces that the U.S. work in Syria is done, that would leave vast swaths of the country open to Iranian and Hezbollah influence. And he's right. This is a concern of Israel. So this week, in addition to that, Jared Kushner, why are my videos not playing? Jared Kushner went to excuse me one second. Okay. For some reason, so Kushner went to do a peace, you know, try to get the peace going. He went
Jared,
to
with your
Syria, Lebanon, and what else? Here's Netanyahu speaking.
things to talk about, how to advance peace, stability, and security in our region, prosperity too. And I think all of them are within our reach. So I'm happy to see you and the effort that you're leading on behalf of the president, with Jason, members of your team. I think this is a sign of the great alliance between us and the great goals that guide us.
It's true. Well, we're very appreciative of your team and all the efforts that they've made. The president is very committed to achieving a solution here that will be able to bring prosperity and peace to all people in this area. And we really appreciate the commitment of the Prime Minister and his team to engaging very thoughtfully and respectfully in the way that the president has asked them to do so. So the relationship between Israel and America is stronger than ever, and we really thank Prime Minister Netanyahu for his leadership and his partnership.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
And it says here that in these meetings, the two-state solution was not publicly mentioned on this trip. So Kushner, and you know, look, this is peace process that's been going on for a long time. You know, you had the Camp David Accords, you had Oslo, you had the Nile River Agreement. I mean, it's just one right after the other, and nothing seems to work. And there's this but there's an issue that I'll talk about here in just a minute. So Jordan's king came a couple weeks ago to meet with Abbas. First time he's been there in quite a long period of time. And the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Muhammad Amin Hussein, said the king came to Ramallah because Jerusalem is occupied. He can't go to Jerusalem. So there's even this thing, this is put up on the wall. It's sort of mocking Trump because he went and prayed at the Western Wall when he was in Jerusalem. And so the wall down around Bethlehem, it's to show Trump embracing the wall, the separation barrier between the Palestinians. So look, this is what they're talking about. This is a great graphics from the Wall Street Journal on Friday about the different solutions that are being talked about, the two-state solution. And you see down here the black lines in the middle on the right, that is Jerusalem. They don't know what to do with Jerusalem. It seems like Jerusalem is a burdensome stone for some reason. I don't know. I read that somewhere. I've heard that that's been floating around for a while. One of the other solutions is to give the Palestinians, the people who call themselves Palestinians, control over certain autonomous areas. Jericho, they already have a lot of that. You see Hebron, and you see how that's, and this is the way, this is sort of the way it is right now. They have some autonomy, but when things get bad, Israel goes in and provides security. Then there's the one-state solution, and there's a graphic there on the left that shows this is a survey that was done, and you see among Israeli Arabs, over 50% want a one-state solution. Palestinians, about 27, 28, 30%, and Israeli Jews, less than 25%. Why? Because the Palestinians believe that they'll demographically overwhelm them. I don't know if that's true. Caroline Glick's book, The Israeli Solution, questions that. And then there's a confederation of two states, which is being floated around. So while they're doing all of this, at the UN, they're getting ready to celebrate this on September 21st, the International Day of Peace. And I'll just tell you what the website says. You can see it on the poster. Together for peace, respect, safety, and dignity for all. I seem to recalling someplace where it says, when they say, what, peace and safety, then, Howler paraphrased, things happen. So, here is one of the other issues that's going on. This is why I say there's this narrow window. This is a good article in Foreign Policy from back in June. The Arab world has never recovered from the loss of 1967. Listen to just a couple paragraphs from there. 50 years after Azim and other Arab intellectuals started to mercilessly deconstruct their ossified political orders, reactionary and primitive religious structures, and stagnant societies, the Arab world has descended further into darkness. Physical, intellectual, and political desolation has claimed many of the once lively metropolises of the Arab region. Damascus, Aleppo, Baghdad, Mosul, Cairo, and Alexandria, with only Beirut still resisting, albeit teetering on the edge. For centuries, these cities constituted a rich human and linguistic mosaic of ancient communities, including Muslims, Christians, Jews, Druze, Arabs, Kurds, Assyrians, and Circassians. In modern times, they were joined by Greek, Armenian, and Italian communities. A vibrant cosmopolitanism found home in the port cities of Alexandria and Beirut, and the cities of the hinterland, such as Aleppo, Damascus, and Baghdad. And what's happened is there's been this decline in the Arab world. The Arab defeat in June 1967 instantly transformed Israel, the little Sparta, into the region's military superpower. 50 years later, Israel has a first world economy with a high-tech industry. Does this sound like the Bible is... These guys don't know Bible prophecy. That's why I pointed out. Israel has a first world economy with a high-tech industry capable of competing with other corporations from non-technologically advanced states. Israel is a country of paradoxes. It is democracy for its Jewish citizens, a partial democracy for its Arab citizens, and a mean occupier of the Palestinians of the West Bank while keeping the Gaza Strip in its grip. Israel is at home in the 21st century, but it is also home for Jewish groups that wallow in religious atavism, intolerance, and anti-modernity, and that are not dissimilar from the like-minded Muslim groups plaguing Arab lands. That's just, I think it's a ridiculous statement. Regardless of what Israeli leaders say publicly about possible land compromises with the Palestinians, their actions in the form of unabated settlement building on Palestinian land speak of their conviction that Israel should maintain enough territories in the West Bank to make the creation of a viable Palestinian state impossible. And so this is this great conflict that's going on. And I think you can read about some of the foundations of that in Ezekiel 35 and 36 and studying history. The New Yorker even noted the end of the road, the decline of the Palestinian national movement. But here's what it says in another article. As the Arab world descends into anarchy, things are looking up for Iran. This is a frightening scenario for the Saudis. Though far from ideal, Tehran has negotiated a deal with the United States that has provided it respite from the sanctions regime. Its Arab Shiite allies have the upper hand in Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. Other Shiite arenas, such as Yemen, Bahrain, and even the eastern province of Saudi Arabia, also seem promising from Iran's point of view. There was a white paper written about the changing regional architecture of the Middle East. It noted the same thing, the decline of Saudi Arabia. So what you see, and Saudi Arabia appears to be on the losing side in Syria. It says this: the void left by Arab weaknesses has been filled by the non-Arab states of the region, Iran and Turkey, and to a lesser degree by Israel, Iran, and Turkey, as opposed to most of the Arab states, are not recently established entities, and unlike many Arab states, are not artificial creations, but large countries of some 80 million people each. Listen, this lines up perfectly with Ezekiel 38 and 39. That's the point. It's to the point where, and it looks like, in Ezekiel 38 and 39, that Sheba and Dedan, which is Saudi Arabia, sit on the sidelines. And they're like, what are you guys doing coming down here against Israel? And this is the state of the world right now. You know, who knows how long their oil reserves will hold out. They're changing kings. They just switch from one crown prince to another. But this is taking place in Saudi Arabia. I believe it was in Saudi Arabia this week. Who is this? Well, this is the Saudi Arabian contingent. And who are they meeting with? Sadr, the Iraqi Shiite Muslim imam that's extremely influential in Iraq, who's a Shiite. This is a significant meeting because it shows that Saudi Arabia is sort of looking for a back way out. So it does appear that there's a decline going on. Somebody suggested this is, I think, from Geopolitical Futures, the new Middle East, because there's really no Iraq anymore. And there's really no Syria, and Lebanon is just barely holding together. And so what's it going to look like? They also had an article this week called The Unconquerable Persian Legacy, showing how Persia, because of the geography of Iran, the geography of that makes it essentially a fortress country, very difficult to attack and occupy. And so Iran's taking advantage of this and moving into Lebanon. And at the same time, in the Golan Heights, the UN wants Israel to give the Golan Heights back. So Syria, this is going on. The Mossad chief has said Iran is filling the vacuum left by the Islamic State retreat in Syria and Iraq, and they're warning about it. He came to Washington, D.C. this week with a contingent of other people from the Israel government to talk to the U.S. about, we really need your help. There's also these reports that Iran is building a missile factory in Syria. Report showing construction is significant development that poses a dilemma for Syria. And what they're doing with this factory report, this building this, is that they're getting to the place where Israel's maybe going to have to do something, which might set off a regional war. And this is Dorgal. Listen to him.
Behind the scenes to accelerate the Iranian ballistic missile program and perhaps many other parts of Iran's military-industrial base. The first major Iranian...
What he said at the beginning was that North Korea is involved in this with Iran.
Iranian ballistic missile, the Shahab-3, was widely viewed when it was first tested in 1998 to be a knockoff of the North Korean Nudong missile. The missile became operational in the Iranian armed forces in 2003, and Iran today fields one of the largest missile forces in the Middle East, largely because of the help it received from North Korean engineers. Very few people have been aware of the fact that Iran also received a missile known as the BM-25 from North Korea. This was originally a Soviet submarine-launched ballistic missile, and it came in two models. One was 2,500 kilometers in range, and the second one was 3,500 kilometers in range. This missile, which was reconfigured to be used on land, gave Iran the capability of striking far outside of the Middle East. Indeed, those ranges give Iran the ability to hit as far as the English Channel.
If North Korea is moving towards an international ballistic missile capability, it will be foolhardy not to consider that Iran will soon be there as well.
And he's right. And so what we have is this, my billboard warning of this Cold War between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which plays into Bible prophecy and what's going on in these different states and the wars going on around Saudi Arabia. It bears watching, but Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin, they call him MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the new crown prince, about 32 years old, of Saudi Arabia, I think is a realist to realize he doesn't have the military power and the alliances to resist what's going on. So now you see Saudi Arabia making diplomatic efforts to reach out to Iran and Russia. And at the same time, and I'll close with this because we have church starting here shortly, Afghanistan. You can see from the control of the map, the dark yellow is Taliban, the red is Islamic State control and presence, and Taliban presence is the light yellow. President said we're going back into Iran. And I only note that we had 100,000 troops there for years, and we weren't able to defeat the Taliban. And there is this fantasy in, I think, our intelligence agencies and our Defense Department that if we're eventually the Taliban will get it and they'll be nice, peaceful, democracy-loving people. And I think it's a fantasy. It's not real. And so I'm concerned about us getting drugged back into Afghanistan. There are reports, I read them this week, from people in the military. Half of our planes in the Navy can't fly. Can't fly, not could fly a little bit, can't fly. And I just think it's a very, Afghanistan is a very difficult issue. It pretty much led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I guess we think we're smarter than, we're not going to get in the same thing. But I know there's a problem there that needs to be contained. But it's a very difficult thing to know what to do. So I'm very concerned with the direction that it's going. Even foreign policy this week talks about, in light of this, does Trump intend to thwart Iran's ambition in Syria? And I think it's a legitimate question. What are we going to do there? Are we going to stop Iran and support Israel? how does that work? And at least initially, things are not encouraging. So I know there's a learning curve for the president. I'm willing to acknowledge that. But I'm also concerned when I see people who I think are good people, like Sebastian Gorka, either being fired or resigning. And he was very honest with his concerns. Look, it's an exciting time to be alive. I think I'm not that worried. Okay, I'm negative, but I'm positive it's going to work out fine. But I know there's trouble ahead. I mean, everything tells me that. All the warning lights are there. But it's a time for us to be more committed to our relationship with Christ than ever. So let's pray and take this up again next week. Father, thanks so much for your word. Thanks for your guidance. Pray that you will protect us, watch over us, give us wisdom, and fill us with your Holy Spirit so we know how to deal with these people that have lost the ability to reason, that we'll be able to share the gospel with them, because that really ultimately is their only hope. Bless us this week as we go. In Jesus' name, amen. Just a reminder,